Right, guys, welcome back to the channel. So, I'm going to be reading from an article today, and this article is going to be about the court case the UFC has found itself in. Now, I didn't really speak about this before because I didn't think it was going to go anywhere because the UFC is always in some type of drama in regards to court cases, you know, with whoever. So, when you're dealing with a billion-dollar company, the billion-dollar company always wins. Well, this court case that they're in, you know, this is going to be if it goes through and they lose, you're talking they're going to lose billions. And this is crazy, guys. I'm not, this is probably the most biggest and the most pivotal point in UFC history. If they get by this unscathed and they win this here, that it's good for them. I can understand the fighters why they are very, very unhappy with the contracts, with the it's sort of like, what way could you describe these contracts? It's like a dictatorship. It's like, you're going to take this contract, there's nothing you can do about it, and we're going to give like a 38-year-old an 8-fight contract. He's going to fight 3 fights, retire, and he's still under contract with us. And if this guy wants to go out and box or go to another promotion, it's up to the UFC whether that guy can actually do that. Even though they're retired, they're still under some type of contract. And yeah, sure, there's all these different clauses that are in that, like I think it's the sunset clause, where basically a law or a contract, the rule of that contract can be broken after a certain amount of time, and those things are implemented, but not all the time. Not all the time. And then when you're dealing with like Francis Ngannou, what he exposed to do with the UFC with the extensions, you would have basically, if you were injured and you couldn't take a fight, or maybe you just didn't want to fight a low ranked opponent, when the UFC offered you an opponent, they would extend your contract by 6 months. Or if you went to a grappling competition or whatever, they extended your contract by 6 months, and you were in this never ending cycle of not being able to get out of your contract. So from the fighter standpoint, if this goes through, it's good for them, but I can't help but feel this is cutting off your nose to spite your face, because if the fighters win this, it might be good initially for the people. Like, I think there's like 1,500 fighters involved in this court case. This could possibly dissolve the UFC. Before we get into the article, I just have to say the UFC is like, I think its yearly grosses over 5 billion, right? Its net worth at the end, what they take is like what they own, after, like what their profit is, their actual profit is 350 million. So if this, well, it is going to court. It's definitely going to court now. People will be looking into this. I think it's like the ninth circle court or something. I've heard that before in Netflix documentaries. I think that's a very serious court proceedings. I think it's like, you do not want to be there, basically, unless if you are on the receiving end of these people. And if this goes through, then they will owe, I think it's between 1.6 billion and 800 million. And that can literally crush the UFC. The UFC right now would take not putting on an event for 6 months than this to go through, and for them to owe any money. Now, for the fighters who would receive compensation from this, obviously it's good for them. But for future fighters and for fighters that are actually in contract right now that maybe need a home, this is going to be devastating for them. And a lot of people will say, well, hold on, they'll just go to another promotion. Well, there's no other promotion in the world. But we'll get into that. Maybe there's one. And this is where the Saudis come into it, because apparently the Saudis are getting their finger into MMA. We'll talk about that just in a little minute. But there's no other promotion right now. There's one championship, there's Bellator, there's Cage Warriors, but there's no juggernaut like the UFC that can come in and give you an 8-fight contract. Okay, it might be really, really bad money, but it's stable money enough for you to live, but not live like a superstar. They take 16% off the profits. And any other promotion, it's like 49 to 50%. The UFC give you 16% off the profits, and that's if you are like a champion. I don't know what the other guys get. I remember Nate Diaz was getting like $30,000 per fight before he fought Conor McGregor. Eddie Alvarez fought for the same money on his previous contract whenever he fought McGregor, and he didn't. I don't think he really made. Well, he made a lot more in regards to pay-per-view points, but he didn't. Um, he didn't make a lot more from the actual UFC. So there's a lot of working components into this, and the UFC are absolute ballers when it comes to contracts. In before I know I'm rambling here a little bit, but you just need to know this. Like I spoke to a few ex UFC fighters. I'm not going to mention their name. This was years ago, when they were saying, "Man, we were so happy to get rid of that contract because we would get paid more for fighting in like a one championship or Bellator just with sponsors alone." So I think it's, it can go either way. If the UFC dissolves and there's no such thing as the UFC anymore, could this possibly be the end of MMA? I don't think so, but it'll definitely turn into sort of like a boxing structure where you'll have multi-promotional fights, and that's not good for the fans, but it is better for the fighters. I will admit that. So let's get into the article now and let's find out what is actually going on, and where does Saudi Arabia come into this? Because guys, the Saudis, if this goes through, Saudi Arabia have got their hands in the PFL. They've got, they're willing to put a lot of money in the sort of the back MMA right now. And if the UFC is their competitor in this for what's going on, possibly could go on in the future, they will welcome the UFC being dissolved or being, losing power at least. So let's get into it now and let's find out what really is going on. Saudi Arabia and a 1 billion fighters lawsuit threatens UFC's future. The UFC has been accused of engineering a monopoly over the world of mixed martial arts, but its leverage may soon be severely weakened. Now, listen, I don't think we're in dispute here about the UFC and its monopoly over MMA, because they have become, once Pride went under, the UFC took over. Do you know what I mean? So obviously they have some type of monopoly over MMA. But what you just need to understand here is, in the UFC's defense, whenever this goes to court, they can turn around and say, well, it's not their fault that they are the power structure of MMA. And what they hand out as contracts isn't deemed slavery. That's what they will say. They will present all, they'll go for all different tiers of fighters. This isn't the champion. This isn't such and such. And this is what we give the champions. And we're well on our right to give people 16% of the profits. We're well on our right to do that. And they could possibly win over that. But if the I don't know if it's what you call a prosecution in this. I don't know if that's what you would call it. But if the people that are going after the UFC, if they turn around and say, well, hold on, 16% for a person that's grossing this much, they will maybe bring up a person like Israel Adesanya and say, well, this person's brought in so much, or even Conor McGregor. Say, well, Conor McGregor brought in this much, and you've give him, maybe they give Conor McGregor a little bit more, maybe they give him like 30%, you've give him 30% of that. That maybe comes under a law that you shouldn't do that. And this is where we're going to get you on like the monopoly thing here. So, it's touch and go, guys. I'm not going to lie to you. It is touch and go about what's going to happen to the UFC. And this is the biggest news in combat sports, in all of combat sports. As the UFC prepares for its upcoming showcase event on Saturday, the real fight is set to take place outside the octagon, within the confines of a courtroom. Last week, the UFC lost its bid to revoke a class action status from hundreds of mixed martial arts fighters who are suing for more than $1 billion in wages. The lawsuit accuses the UFC parent company Zuffa LLC of illegally acquiring and maintaining a monopoly over the MMA industry. Now, what's key in that is not actually having the monopoly over the MMA, but it's actually, how did you acquire that? Did you acquire that illegally or legally? And everybody and their granddaughter and their grandson will be looking into this. If they've got something to gain from the UFC going down, everybody will be looking into this, which requires the fighter which resulted in fighters being paid a fraction of what they would earn in a competitive marketplace. Well, Then to the UFC's defense, they will turn around and say, well, it's not a competitive marketplace, and that's not our fault. We acquired this business legally, um, and we're here from our own hard work. And if it's not our fault one championship isn't doing good. Bellator's been around for years, and they haven't, they've had the ability to, uh, build up on their own monopoly and become par with us, and they haven't. We just got a better business model. That's what their defense will be in this, and they'll probably show receipts and wages and everything to prove that. And I have to say, on a side note, if there's any other MMA company, any promotion, they might be called to see about their earnings and what they earn. Because on a side note, I'm hearing in the background that the UFC uh, is low key and on a completely different court case that has this isn't even, it's just an accusation as it stands. It hasn't even reached the legality process yet. That the UFC is being accused of tax evasion, and that's why they only declare a certain amount of income, and that's why they pay certain fighters that amount of money. I'm not saying that's true, but apparently that's a thing that will be coming up in the future. Um, Now, with a pivotal ruling from the US Ninth Circuit Court of Appeals, the lawsuit is scheduled to start in April 2024. So next year is going to be absolutely humongous for the UFC. Um, and that's that ninth. I don't really know too much about that. I know I've heard this before, that if you really want something done, if it gets through to the Ninth Circuit Court of Appeals, I mean, you don't want to getting that far, basically. The plaintiffs, who could include more than 1,200 fighters who competed in the UFC from 2010 to 2017, are seeking between 800 million and 1.6 billion in damages. If successful, the lawsuit could reshape the landscape of MMA and redefine how the UFC operates. So that is a lot of money. So as I said before at the beginning of this here, the UFC grosses 5 billion, but their net is 350 million. So 5 billion is what they take in all over, but then their profit is 350 million roundabout. So for 1,200 fighters to win this and win between 800 million and 1.6 billion, even going at the lower end there, 800 million, would be devastating for the UFC. In 2006, following the collapse of Japan-based Pride FC, the UFC solidified its grip on the MMA industry, effectively becoming the undisputed power in the sport. This ascendancy granted the UFC substantial leverage when it came to negotiating with fighters. Now, this is going to be key in the court case. So, what I've just highlighted there, in 2006, following the collapse of Japan-based Pride FC, which arguably, you know, people say was better. I disagree with that. I think the way the sport has evolved is it got a lot to do with the UFC. They've put a lot of hard work into the evolution of MMA, but the UFC solidified its grip on the MMA industry. Now, this is the part which I think that is going to go for the UFC, because it's not the UFC's fault. Even if they bought Pride, even if they buy Bellator, even if they buy one championship, it's not their fault for buying things. We live in a capitalism. Everybody's able to buy and capitalize, and that's legally acquiring a monopoly over the sport. That's not illegal to do that. And then whatever they want to offer as a contract, that is up to them. Do you know what I mean? That is up to them. So I don't think the fighters are going to win this, but if this goes wrong for the UFC, this is devastating. This is absolutely devastating. One of the most significant consequences of the UFC's dominance was a noticeable decline in fighter pay. The UFC held a virtual monopoly over the MMA industry, leaving fighters with limited bargaining power with few viable alternatives. Fighters faced a stark reality: accept the terms offered by the UFC or risk being left without anywhere else to fight professionally. Now, this here will be brought up, right? Because the fighters, what their case will be is, well, actually, if we left the UFC, we wouldn't make the same money. Well, that's not actually true, because you did have Bellator and you did have one championship, and you had many other um, organizations, right? Smaller organizations sort of circling these other big ones. Just imagine the UFC is the sun, right? Is the sun. They are the mega power of the solar system. And then you have Bellator, which would be the second biggest planet. I'm stupid when it comes to the space, but you get what I'm saying. The second biggest planet, which could be Jupiter, say, right? And then that would be Bellator, and then one championship would be like Mars or something, right? Now there is other little planets circling. You've got like Cage Warriors, which could be like Pluto, but the UFC's the sun. Without the sun, it ceases to exist. Basically, the whole thing ceases to exist. Um, and what the fighters will say here is, well, actually, if we left the UFC because they had such a hold in MMA, the other promotions couldn't. There would be no point of us even staying in the sport, and that's going to be a credible argument with them. But I don't even think that holds up in court, because once again, we live in a capitalistic market. We live in capitalism, and the UFC can prove that they didn't create this monopoly, or they didn't get a hold of this monopoly uh, via illegal means. That this was all done legally. We're the powerhouse of the sport, regardless. It's like Manchester United in the Premier League. The Manchester United are basically, without Manchester United in the Premier League, that's like a quarter or even half of the Premier League's money that comes in to England. So it's not their fault that they're that popular. It's just the way it is. As a result, fighters pay fail to reflect the growing popularity and profitability of the sport, leaving many athletes struggling to make ends meet. Unlike the vast majority of sports leagues and organizations where athletes receive anywhere between 47 and 50% of revenue, the UFC has historically paid between 16 and 19% of its revenues to fighters. Now, this is probably where they're going to win. Now, what the UFC might have to do here, they might have to start paying more to fighters. So you'll see an increase of 16 to 19%, maybe go up to 25, 30%. And that's still quite low, because in other combat sports, as you see there, it's between 47 and 50. So the UFC, for damage limitation here, just say their hands forced, maybe there's a good argument pressed upon them. The court might say, well, you've got two options here. Either you proceed with this, or we rule on you pay more to the fighters percentage wise. So you're going to start paying 25 to 30%, because what you're paying right now isn't fair. Moreover, the UFC's dominant position allowed it to pressure fighters into signing long term contracts that often included restrictive non compete clauses. This clause effectively prevented fighters from participating in other MMA organizations, locking them into exclusive agreements with the UFC. This not only limited fighters' earnings and career flexibility, but also raised concerns about the fairness and competitiveness of the sport. Fighters found themselves trapped in these agreements, unable to explore other opportunities to seek better compensation elsewhere. Now, here's the hypocrisy, and here's where this might hold up. So let me talk about the end part there. So we've just established they're going to be coming at this angle in court. They're going to say, well, we didn't have the ability to go elsewhere because the UFC had such a monopoly on the sport. They acquired this illegally, so we couldn't have went elsewhere to get better money. Now they've just ruined their argument in that paragraph at the end. If that was the case, then why would they want out of a contract to explore other opportunities to seek better compensation elsewhere because that wouldn't exist. Do you understand me? So the UFC's solicitors, lawyers will dismantle them within that. But where they might have a case is, moreover, the UFC's dominant position allowed it to pressure fighters into signing long-term contracts that often included restrictive non-compete clauses. That is where the UFC might fail, because that does seem like a slave contract. As I say, they would give 38-year-olds 8-fight contracts. The 38-year-old would have 3 fights, retire, and still be in contract with the UFC. So, for instance, if they took a year out and they wanted to go box, they would have to go to the UFC and say, "Look, I want to fight for a different promotion," and the UFC could say no. And in some cases, they would have non-compete clauses. So even after the contract ends, they wouldn't be able to compete in another organization. I don't know if that's what that means or not, because I've never actually heard of that before. So forgive me for actually speaking on that. I actually don't know about that, but I think that that's where the sunset clause comes in, where it's like the opposite. It's not the opposite, but like the sunset clause comes in, where there's only a certain amount of time your contract can be held over your head for. But it does seem like this is where we're getting into the nitty gritty now. This is the parts that I love, reading these little parts. But you know, the fighters have a case, but the UFC could dismantle this easily if they wanted to. Meanwhile, the UFC continues to generate record revenues. According to its parent company, Endeavor, SEC filings, the organization generated 1.14 billion in 2022. During the first 2 quarters of 2023, the UFC produced 611.9 million in revenue, up 16% from the first 2 quarters of 2022. So they're buying it in, they're getting lots of money, and this is why the court case is going on, because the fighters are saying, look, they're getting record numbers in regards to profit here, and we are on still the same pay. And that's probably going to be the baseline of this, because if the UFC's defense is, well, hold on, it's not our fault, we didn't force their hand to sign it. They could have signed for anybody. This is the contract we offered. They signed it and they had to abide by that contract. Well, if they can prove that these fighters didn't have any other option, or that they had, the UFC gained an illegal monopoly over MMA, then everything else can just crumble around the UFC, and then their record profits will be held against them 100%. The combination of reduced pay and contractual restrictions led a group of former UFC fighters to file an antitrust lawsuit against the UFC in December 2014. Now, nearly a decade after the initial filing, the case appears to be heading to trial. And that's, I didn't really want to speak about it, but I actually was going to speak about this 2 years ago, but this was filed in 2014. So obviously everybody thought that, it wasn't going to go anywhere, but it's going ahead now. Somebody has a friend in a high place. If the plaintiffs secure a favorable ruling, the consequences could be profound. It not only implies a substantial financial burden for the UFC to compensate fighters, it could also trigger a shift in the way the organization conducts its business. The transformation may encompass a reevaluation of the revenue distribution between the UFC and its fighters, granting fighters greater bargaining power and potentially allowing more control over the use of their likenesses in areas such as advertising. Well, yeah, such adjustments could have a significant detrimental impact of the UFC's business model and overall profitability. Now, this here, another key point. Now, one of the things I disagree with in regards to the UFC is the fact that fighters can't advertise. They can't get sponsors and advertise that on their shorts. That was one of the biggest losses for fighters in the UFC. Brendan Schaub, I know some of you don't like him, exposed this. He says, look, my sponsor money was more than what the UFC was paying me. And Dana White called him out on it and says, you're talking absolute horseshit here, mate. But it turned out that Brendan Schaub was telling the truth. Now, this is going to, at the very least, when this goes through to court, there's going to be a reevaluation of the revenue distribution between the UFC and the fighters. That is going to happen regardless. And I can see the percentage of what they pay fighters and what they take out of the kitty to pay fighters going up. I can definitely see that. And it will mean a loss for the UFC, and their business model will change. You'll probably then see more gimmick fights, and then you don't. Where does that stop? You know, we're going to maybe have more cross promotion fights. The reason why the UFC is able to not put on boxing matches, not have these gimmick fights like more Conor McGregor's and Floyd Mayweather's, is because their model is based around them getting as much money as possible. The UFC is also dealing with uh, a follow-on antitrust lawsuit filed by a pair of former UFC fighters. While the initial lawsuit covers fighters up to the cutoff date of 30th of June 2017, the second lawsuit covers fighters who competed from June 2017 to the present day. So it's an ongoing issue. This is not going to stop until this is heard. This is why it's gained traction. Considering the risks associated with proceeding to trial in an antitrust lawsuit, the UFC may explore the possibility of reaching a settlement with the plaintiffs. Although a settlement would be undoubtedly entail a financial burden for the organization, it serves as a means to steer clear of less favorable outcome that could arise from a jury trial. Now, this is key. So if they settle, then that means they're going to settle with the fighters that have took them to court. The UFC is going to definitely 100% not want any of this. But if they settle, how much money is that? Is that the 800 million, the 1.6 billion? You're talking about 1,500 fighters here. If it goes to court and a jury sees this, they could say, well, hold on, the structure needs to change, the percentage needs to go up. So what does the UFC want? A double whammy where they're going to have to change their business model or just pay out to the fighters now? I think the cat's out of the bag, because if they pay out the fighters now and the rest of the UFC roster sees this, the current UFC roster sees this, they're going to say, well, hold on, you've paid them all that money. What about our money? Are we getting a rise in the future? Is our contracts going to change? This could, them paying fighters for what they're owed from years ago, could be arguably a contract breach for today, because you, for instance, if you're a current UFC fighter, you could turn around and say, well, hold on, my contract's been breached now because they've won their money. My money's obviously should be changed and I should be getting more. And that could trigger a breach of contract or of some kind, or maybe I'm butchering that, but you get what I'm saying. Beyond the UFC's class action concerns, the organization is also facing the threat of competition after Saudi Arabia's 100 million investment into the Professional Fighters League (PFL) of UFC competitor. The deal is among the latest examples of the kingdom's unprecedented sports dive, which includes investments in soccer, golf, Formula One, and boxing. Guys, I have to say this to you, right? I forget that he was Jordan Henderson was a midfielder for Liverpool. He played in front of 900 people. 900 people the other day, and he went over there. He's getting something like £700,000 a week playing in Saudi Arabia. These guys have got unlimited funds. They have got trillions. This is pennies to them. They will see this situation as a win for them. If the UFC go under, they will come in and they will have the next UFC. They'll probably buy the UFC name and just solely hold the UFC in Saudi Arabia. I could see something like that happening. If not, they're definitely going to be a big competitor to the UFC for the future. As I say, if they pump in a lot of money into the PFL, do you think that's 100 million registered? I guarantee there's a lot more that's, a little backhander here and there to say, well, just take that. That's fine. Do you know what I mean? 100 million investment into the PFL. That's just the start. They will invest a lot of money into whatever organization is going to make them the powerhouse in MMA, because those guys love MMA. So we do have a new kid on the block. It is the Saudis, and the UFC have some serious competition on their hand here. So the Saudis will be rooting for the UFC to go under 100%. During the first earnings, all of Endeavor's TKO Group, the public company created by the merger of the UFC and WWE. See, uh, so it's TKO, Endeavor's TKO Group own the UFC and the WWE. They're under the same blanket, I believe. Ari Emanuel played down concerns that Saudi Arabia's investment in the PFL would be problematic for his organization, citing the UFC's own plans to host a fight night event in the kingdom next year. But that's just like, it's like mob bosses. See this as mob bosses. So you have, a mob boss is going to have dinner with another mob boss and play nice, and maybe even let him eat for free in his restaurant because he's another mob boss. That's what you're dealing with here. Of course, Saudi Arabia is going to allow this, but this is 100% problematic for the UFC. But it's good problems because it's going to raise the bar for us. We're going to get more fights. I do believe the Saudis' plans is to become on par with the UFC with the using the PFL. Ariel Helwani keeps playing down the PFL, but the PFL on the trajectory that it's at with the money that's being pumped into it, you're going to see a lot of fighters heading over there, because they want that Saudi money. Look what's happening with the Premier League. There's fighters leaving, playing in front of 900 people for £700,000 pound a week. Do you know what I mean? It's unlimited money. The Saudis have unlimited money. Competition's not new for the UFC or the WWE. Emmanuel said during the call, MMA is probably the fastest growing sport, and we're encouraged by the interest. Rising tides left all boats. In my opinion, we don't see it as a zero sum game. Look, obviously the UFC are all, if they get by this sticky point in their life here, having competitors, it's still a couple of years away, so they always will have the advantage. They've the plan ahead. But if they have to start paying more, or if Saudi Arabia, for instance, goes, well, hold on, what we'll do is we'll just offer Conor McGregor quadruple what the UFC is paying him, and we'll pay out his contract. It's a no-brainer. That's the level of money that you're dealing with here. You're dealing with guys that are trillionaires. Nevertheless, Saudi Arabia's interest in MMA could spell trouble for the UFC earlier this year. The US-based PGA Tour and its Saudi-funded rivals Live Golf announced plans to merge their business after a bitter battle for control of men's professional golf. The surprising turn of events highlighted Saudi Arabia's financial power as the kingdom succeeded in orchestrating the capitulation of a major US sports organization by investing billions of dollars in launching a rival league, luring top players with lucrative contracts and pressuring the PGA through expensive legal action. I cannot stress this enough. The Saudis are ballers. They are the richest people on planet Earth. You're dealing with trillionaires, and they're doing that with the Premier League too. China, we always thought China was going to be that country that would take over the Premier League, that were giving like people like £800,000 a week, to play over there. But the Saudis have came in here, and they're taking Premier League players. Like Jordan Henderson is playing in Saudi Arabia in front of 900 people for £700,000 a week. It's crazy. I don't know if it's 700,000, even if it's 200,000. Jordan Henderson is like Messi to them. That's the level of football that they play over there. Although the UFC may not encounter an outcome similar to that of the PGA Tour, it has already experienced a glimpse of Saudi Arabia's competitive influence. After a lengthy contract dispute, former UFC heavyweight champion Francis Ngannou was stripped of his title and released from the organization as a free agent. He went on to sign with the PFL and has secured a mega fight against the heavyweight boxing champion Tyson Fury in Saudi Arabia, a bout that reportedly netted more money than his entire UFC earnings combined. And Ngannou's success could spur more fighters to explore free agency in pursuit of more lucrative opportunities elsewhere. Right, guys. So the end part there, Francis and Ngannou. So you have to understand, right? Nothing's a coincidence to me. This is all happening now after the Ngannou fight. I'm not saying Ngannou had anything to do with this, by the way. I'm saying that there is a shift. There's going to be a change in the way the UFC operates. If this goes through, the worst case scenario for the UFC, that they have to pay out all that money and they have to change their business model and how they pay the fighters. If the UFC wins, nothing changes. The best case scenario, nothing changes for the UFC. But I don't think a court or not a court case or a civil court or a lawsuit that's been started from 2014 that's still active right up until now, I don't think that's going to be for nothing. They're going to win something. If the fighters win money, is that going to start a breach in contract with the current UFC roster where they're going to go, well, hold on, you've paid them, you've acknowledged that you've done wrong to them, so obviously you're doing wrong to us. That could be seen as a contract breach. You could see renewals of contracts and fighters being paid more. The UFC might actually just do that themselves if they don't want any heat on themselves and less court cases. But the Francis Ngannou situation, he took the risk, he left. Now, what you need to know about Saudi Arabia. Saudi Arabia are worth trillions. The reason why that fight and pay-per-view not bombed, but it didn't do as well, is because it was in Saudi Arabia and they put it on at a time that they wanted. Now, the thing about it is, that's the way it's always going to be with them because they don't care about money. The UFC's taking this from a business standpoint. The Saudis are taking this from, we want our country to look good. We're being accused of beheadings in the street for bread thieves. We want our country to look good. Saudi Arabia, the Kingdom of Saudi Arabia, has warehouses full of people that literally sit on Twitter all day to make Saudi Arabia look good. If you say anything bad about Saudi Arabia on Twitter, literally, it's just inundated with people from that in that warehouse just trying to debunk what you're saying, and they're always writing positive things about Saudi Arabia. So Saudi Arabia stays at the top of Twitter. That's what they're like. So they're creating. They want to create a sort of an MMA empire, a golf empire, a soccer empire, a whatever empire, tiddlywinks empire. Not because they want to make profit, because they want themselves to be the powerhouse and it makes them look good. The UFC can't really compete with that. So that's why Francis Ngannou did win, because they didn't care about selling pay-per-views. They cared about getting a really good fight and for them to be entertained and for the whole world to watch them to make them look good. And that's it. So you can't compete with that. You've got one company that's doing it for profit and you've got another company. If you know, I'm not saying the PFL here, but I'm just saying the Saudis, if they stay with the PFL, if they make their own sort of fight promotion, they're just doing that not for profit, but to make their country look good. And you cannot compete with that. So there's going to be a change, guys. There's a change. Don't know what's going to happen with this lawsuit. I'm not a solicitor, but gun to my head, I would say the UFC is going to win. But what I'm hearing is to get to this process of the ninth circle court, whatever you call it, that is bad for the UFC. So it's 50-50 at the minute. Right, guys, that's what I have for you today. Remember, smash the like button, subscribe, hit the notification bell, leave a comment, tell me what you think. The only thing I want you to do, I do not want your money. I do not want anything like that. All I want you to do, subscribe, hit that notification bell, and like the video. That's it. That's all I want from you. That's all you have to do. If you want, leave a comment in the comment section because your opinion matters to me. And if you really want to help me out, just share a copy, link the clipboard, make a little social media post, send to a friend on Facebook or WhatsApp Messenger. Sharing is caring, spreading the word is good. And that's it, guys. Oh, yeah. All my social media links can be found in the description of this video. That is the end of the video, guys. Thank you very much for tuning in. Peace.